Jorge Luis Borges' story, The Lottery in Babylon, is rather short, but there's a lot that is packed in there about the nature of human freedom, about causality, about randomness, about designs. There's even a sort of history that we can't entirely trust, but which is a central part of this story. So we learn that the monstrous variety of this person's life, like all men of Babylon, he's done this, he's done that. You know, he's been proconsul, he's been a slave, he's known omnipotence, ignominy, imprisonment. I won't go on for all of that. You can read the examples in the story. He owes that almost monstrous variety to an institution, the lottery, which is, he says, unknown in other nations or at work in them imperfectly or secretly. So there is the possibility that this fictional institution is actually at work imperfectly or secretly in other societies. We don't really know. Now, he's able to talk about this in part because he's far from Babylon and its beloved customs, and he's thinking with some bewilderment about the lottery and the blasphemous conjectures shrouded men whisper in the half-light of dawn or evening, which we'll come to at the end, these various interpretations of the lottery and its existence or non-existence. So he tells us that he has not delved into this institution's history. I know that sages cannot agree about its mighty purposes. I know as much as a man untutored in astrology might know about the moon. All he does know is that mine is a dizzying country in which the lottery is, as he puts it, a major element of reality. And maybe that's actually underplaying it a bit. It's not just one element of reality. It is what structures the reality of human beings within at least that culture or civilization. Now, it's kind of funny because he's just said, well, you know, I'm ignorant of its history, and then he goes on to recount a history. He says, my father would tell how once, long ago, centuries, years, the lottery in Babylon was a game played by commoners. And perhaps the rest of this historical account comes from his father. We don't really know. I do want to point out that much later in the story, he's going to tell us, our historians, the most perspicacious on the planet, have invented a method for correcting chance. It is well known the outcomes of this method are, in general, trustworthy, and there's nothing so tainted with fiction as the history of the company. Now, that is what we're actually going to get going back to a little bit earlier in the story. So we begin with, as he calls it, rudimentary lotteries, plural, right? And these are actually a failure. What are these lotteries? Barbers would take a man's copper coins and give back rectangles made of bone or parchment and adorned with symbols. Then they would hold a drawing. Those smiled upon by fate would, with no further corroboration by chance, win coins minted of silver. The procedure was, as you can see, rudimentary. Now that's kind of funny because when we think of lotteries in our present day, or actually throughout the centuries, that's typically what they are. But there is the potential for a lottery to become something more than that. And why do these lotteries fail? He says, well, they had no moral force whatsoever. They appealed not to all a man's faculties, but only to his hopefulness. So this generates public indifference. These lotteries begin to lose money, and then we get an innovation that is going to take place. What could make the lottery more interesting? Well, so you pay into the lottery and you have the chance to win something. What if you also have the chance to lose? So they come up with the idea of having a few unlucky draws. Those who bought the numbered rectangles now had a twofold chance. They might win a sum of money, or they might be required to pay a fine, sometimes a considerable one, and this piqued the public interest. So a person who didn't buy one was considered cowardly, a man with no spirit of adventure, right? In time, this justified contempt found a second target, not just the man who didn't play, but the man who lost and paid the fine. And the company, as it's coming to be known, needs to collect these fines in order to pay the winners. It's got to keep things going, right? And so a whole bunch of people choose not to pay their fines, and they are given jail time instead. And Borges says, from that gauntlet thrown down by a few men sprang the company's omnipotence, its ecclesiastical, metaphysical force. So we have a transformation going from just being a business, handling something that people in that culture are quite interested in, to ecclesiastical, that is churchly, religious, and metaphysical extent, right? So what we're going to get here is, as he's going to call it, the first appearance of non-pecuniary elements in the lottery. What are these? Well, instead of having a fine, why not just have the jail time on the drawing tickets, right? And assign those. So this is non-monetary, and this raises yet more interest. He says, it was met with great success. The company was forced by its players to increase the number of unlucky draws. And then we get some changes taking place. He says, as everyone knows, the people of Babylon are great admirers of logic and even symmetry. It was inconsistent. Lucky numbers should pay off in round silver coins, while unlucky ones were measured in days and nights of jail. Certain moralists argued, I think quite correctly, the possession of coins did not always bring about happiness, and other forms of happiness were perhaps more direct. And then we get a second complaint from the lower caste neighborhoods. The members of the priestly class gambled heavily and so enjoyed all the vicissitudes of terror and hope. The poor, with understandable or inevitable envy, saw themselves denied access to that famously delightful, even sensual wheel, the fair and reasonable desire that all men and women, rich and poor, be able to take part equally in the lottery, inspired indignant demonstrations. And what we end up getting is a new stage of history. And we get an interesting paradox. A slave stole a crimson ticket. The drawing determined that ticket entitled the bearer to have his tongue burned out. The code of law provided the same sentence for stealing a lottery ticket. Some Babylonians argued the slave deserved the burning iron for being a thief. Others, more magnanimous, that the executioner should employ the iron because fate had thus decreed. There were disturbances, bloodshed, but the masses of Babylon at last imposed their will. What is their will? The company is forced to take on all public power. The company becomes the rulership and governance of Babylon. That's one big thing. Second, the lottery was made secret, free of charge, and open to all. There's no more purchasing. Every free citizen automatically took part in the sacred drawings. And so the consequences, it says, were incalculable. A lucky draw might bring about a man's elevation to the council of the Magi, or the imprisonment of his enemy, or might allow him to find in the peaceful dimness of his room the woman who would begin to disturb him, or whom he'd never hope to see again. An unlucky draw, mutilation, dishonor of many kinds, death itself. Sometimes a single event. Now notice what's going on here. This is really important. Sometimes a single event would be the inspired outcome of 30 or 40 drawings. Combining bets was difficult, but we must recall that the individuals of the company were and still are all-powerful and clever. So we have all sorts of various interesting convolutions that are supposedly random but are requiring considerable coordination on the part of the company as it assumes greater and greater power within not only the public, but let's say the behind-the-scenes aspects of Babylon. And it turns out that the company sort of retreats and is operating in secrecy, although we find out they employ suggestion, magic, spies, astrologers. And there were certain stone lions, a sacred latrine, some cracks in a dusty aqueduct. These places, it was generally believed, gave access to the company. And so people would deposit their writings there. And then we read, there was talk of favoritism, of corruption. The company did not reply directly. Instead, it provides an apologia, a justification of itself, numbered now among the sacred scriptures. And what does the apologia say? The lottery is an interpolation of chance into the order of the universe. So, interpolation, meaning to place within, there's a overall structure and order of the universe. The lottery adds chance, injects chance within that order. So to accept errors is to strengthen chance, not to contravene it, right? Now, as he's going to point out, this statement quieted the public's concerns about corruption, favoritism, all of that. But it also produced other effects, perhaps unforeseen by its author. It profoundly changed the spirit and operations of the company. And he says, I can't tell you too much about that, but because my ship's going to sail, but I'll just outline it for you. And he goes on and says, nobody until that time had attempted to produce a general theory of gaming, right? But this semi-official statement I mentioned inspired numerous debates of a legal and mathematical nature. From one of them, there emerged the following conjecture. If the lottery is an intensification of chance, a periodic infusion of chaos into the cosmos, then is it not appropriate chance intervene in every aspect of the drawing, not just one? So, for example, is it not ludicrous that chance should dictate a person's death while the circumstances of that death, whether private or public, drawn out for an hour or a century, should not be subject to chance? These perfectly reasonable objections prompted sweeping reform. The complexities of the new system are understood by only a handful of specialists. I will attempt to summarize them, even if only symbolically. So how does he do that? He provides examples. So let's imagine a drawing is taking place, and what do we find? It condemns a person to death. So then they have to hold another drawing. Out of that second drawing come 9 possible executors. Of those 9, 4 might initiate a third drawing to determine the name of the executioner. 2 might replace the unlucky draw with a lucky one, discovery of a treasure. Another might decide the death should be exacerbated, death with dishonor, with or without the refinement of torture. Others might refuse to simply carry out the sentence, and he says, that is the scheme of the lottery put symbolically. In reality, the number of drawings is infinite. And that seems to raise a paradox. Well, how can a finite entity in finite time carry out infinite drawings? Isn't this the problem of Zeno's paradox with Achilles and the tortoise, he says? And he says, no, it's only a problem if time is not infinitely subdivisible, right? And then he talks about that infinitude coincides remarkably well with the sinuous numbers of chance and the heavenly archetype of the lottery, beloved of the Platonists. And he brings up a Roman emperor, Heliogabalus, right, who did something like this lottery, and he comes from Asia Minor among the priests of his eponymous God. And then they talk about adding even more chance into it. So there's all sorts of drawings that pertain to the citizens of Babylon, what's going to happen to them, the agency, how it's going to happen. They're all connected together. But then there are also, as he says, impersonal drawings whose purpose is unclear. Here's some examples. Decreeing a sapphire from Taprobana be thrown into the waters of the Euphrates. A bird be released from the top of a certain tower. Every 100 years, a grain of sand be added to or taken from the countless grains of sand on a certain beach. And then he says, sometimes the consequences are terrible for even these seemingly trivial matters, because everything is connected in a causal nexus, but one in which we've introduced uncertainty, randomness, chaos, right? And this has certain effects. Now, we've talked about the history of Babylon and the company and the lottery up to this point. He tells us a little bit earlier the Babylonians are not a speculative people, right? Is that really the case, or is that a false statement in a way? Well, we're going to see. He will tell us that the customs are now steeped in chance. So the purchaser of a dozen amphorae of Damascene wine will not be surprised if one contains a talisman or a viper. The scribe who writes out a contract never fails to introduce some error. I, myself, in this hurried statement have misrepresented some splendor, some atrocity, perhaps to some mysterious monotony. He talks about our historians, the passage we've already talked about, and then he says, scribes take a secret oath to omit, interpolate, alter. Indirect falsehood is also practiced. So, can we trust this history? Maybe not, but that's all we have to go on as well. And the Babylonians have become accustomed to this. In fact, what they do could be deliberate, like the scribes deliberately introducing some error, or it might just be accidental or random things that happen. He gives an example of the drunken man who blurts out an absurd command, or the sleeping man who suddenly awakens and turns and chokes to death the woman sleeping at his side. And he says, are they not, perhaps, implementing one of the company's secret decisions? We don't know whether the things that we're doing, even if they seem to be random, unthought of, accidental, are not being guided by drawings of the company. So, as he says, nobody can claim to be an imposter. We're all not only subject to this, but part of the workings of the lottery. And here we get to some conjectures. So the Babylonians, not a speculative people. Well, yes, they are. We certainly find this out by the end, right? Because we have 5 different possibilities, 5 different conjectures that are discussed. Some suggest the company ceased to exist hundreds of years ago, and the sacred disorder of our lives is purely hereditary, traditional. That's one explanation of how things might be working. The reason we don't see the company is because the company is no longer around. It's just established a culture in which people believe in this. Another is that the company is eternal and will endure until the very end of time, when the last God shall annihilate the earth. A third declares that the company is omnipotent, but affects only small things. The cry of a bird, the shades of rust and dust, the half-dreams that come at dawn. And here we have a paradox, right? If it's omnipotent, why doesn't it exercise that omnipotence? Why only intervene in small things? Perhaps because small things are big enough to, make things happen, like in those impersonal drawings. And then we get one that's really quite interesting. The company has never existed and never will exist. Well, then what's been going on this entire time? How did this history take place? Well, we don't know. And then finally, the last one. no less despicable, right? Argues it makes no difference whether one affirms or denies the reality of the shadowy corporation. Why? Because Babylon is nothing but an infinite game of chance. Babylon itself is a lottery. It's not the lottery in Babylon, unless you want to count the in as hollowing out every structure, every part, every nook and cranny of this city, this civilization that is Babylon. So we end with these conjectures, the narrator not telling us which of them he favors, just setting them out as the things that heresiarchs and people murmur about in dark corners. So we don't actually wind up with some sort of full explanation, just very interesting hints at it that can then lead us into speculation about the nature of chance, cause, determinism, and our own freedom or lack thereof.